From FingerLakes1.com, I'm Josh Durso, and this is Inside the FLX. Today's program is going to be a little different than our normal episodes. The topic is mental illness, and it's a serious topic, and we're going to try to do a little bit of a deep dive here on some of the questions surrounding it, some of the misconceptions, some of the stats, some of the stuff that really needs to be talked about more. My guest this hour is Brigitt Schaffner of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, the Finger Lakes chapter. Thanks so much for coming in, and thanks for being a part of the show.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here and to share a little bit about our organization. So
the first question, probably the easiest to answer. So what is the Alliance? What does it help serve or help accomplish?
Well, the Alliance is the oldest grassroots organization working towards bettering the lives of people with mental illness. So that's a pretty small nutshell there. But our main focus is helping the caregivers. Usually it's a family member, sometimes it's a close friend, but it's working to support the caregivers of folks who are living with a mental illness.
So I guess one of the other, when we were teasing this conversation a little bit on social media, one of the questions that, one of the themes that seemed to keep coming up was confusion around the definition of mental illness, specifically what that sort of encompasses, what it doesn't encompass. If you could just give us sort of the broad strokes of what mental illness is versus what it is not.
Well, thanks for asking that question, because I think that's certainly one of the things that family members face quite often, particularly when they start talking about someone having depression. Mm-hmm. And there's a huge difference between having a bad day, a bad week, versus clinical depression. Mm-hmm. So it's important to understand that it's a very, very serious illness. Certainly depression, anxiety, there is a large number of folks who deal with that on a daily basis. And then you're asking a question that's actually a little hard to answer, because mental illnesses are very complex. Mm-hmm. And we're just now starting to get a much larger understanding of the fact that oftentimes people might have co-concurring mental illnesses, and especially along with co-concurring substance abuse. It tends to be extremely complex. And so part of what our organization does is work towards educating not only the family members, the caregivers that we generally work with, but the general public as well. And it is important to note that we are making some really great progress in the diagnosis of mental illnesses. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, there isn't a blood test that you can take. There isn't a quick lab work that can be drawn up. And so the really difficult part of a mental illness is first just understanding what is really going on with the person. And that unfortunately tends to usually come to light right when the person is becoming their own individual adult, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's right at a time when they're going off to do their own thing, and communication starts to get a little more lax with family members, and then suddenly folks find themselves in a situation that they are extremely confused about, and then bringing the family in at that time is very important, but also it's very difficult to do. Some of our HEPA laws are fantastic and great. We respect them and appreciate, we all appreciate, having privacy and knowing what is ours to keep private. But at the same time, sometimes it's really difficult for family, caregivers to really understand. And until they can understand, they can't really begin to help. Mm-hmm. Right?
Now, you referenced something that I did see pop up a few times in the questions that were coming in before this show. How difficult is it, or what challenges are sort of tacked on to this issue overall when a lot of the signs or symptoms are sort of presenting during that time of change, those adolescent years and then the few years that follow the early 20s, when people are kind of going through a lot of changes through that period anyway.
Right. So it's just really difficult because we all go through a period in our lives when we're trying to figure out who we are, and there's a lot of stress. Right? You're going off a lot of times to college, or you're starting a new job, a first job, maybe a real job, the first real job you've ever had. And so in addition to all of those stresses, there's a lot of pressure to be successful. And so folks are dealing with all of that, and then to either have a psychotic break or start to have suicidal thoughts, to start to not understand why you can't get out of bed in the morning, why all of a sudden you can't sleep, so there's both sides of it. But really, it's, for the most part, mental illnesses start to come on in very slow waves. Sometimes people do have a very severe and sudden psychotic break, but most of the times there's some warning signs, some things that starts to pop up. But our society so often just tries to brush it off as, you can deal with it, suck it up, and you're just, having a moment, just get over it. And so people try to do that. And then I think that's where it's unfortunate that we're not more proactive with mental health and understanding our mental health, because then we get to that point where there is a more definite psychotic break, or you're definitely going down a path that is harder to come back from. But, as I mentioned, there's no magic test that someone can take. And then the other whole side of it is that folks really don't want to be mentally ill.
Right.
So when they start talking and start seeking help, they want a quick fix. They want to understand that this is just something. I'm just going to get over this, and I'm going to move on, and life is going to be great. So in some cases, there's a little bit of denial, right? It's scary. Who wants to get that diagnosis of schizophrenia or bipolar? And so a lot of times people might just avoid what is really happening. And so many, many different reasons why it's so difficult to get a diagnosis. But and then, as I also mentioned, there seems to be now a greater understanding of overlapping different syndromes. And so it is hard, because you might talk to one care provider and they might come to one conclusion, and you talk to another care provider and they come to another conclusion. And that's because sometimes we're just presenting our problems at different levels, at different times of care. So it makes it really hard to pull that all out and unpack it and try to really get to the real issues that are going on. And so, again, it's very hopeful that I think that we are starting to look more at what can we do to help people and get them on the road to recovery, rather than just looking at their symptoms, treating their symptoms, and just thinking they're done with it.
Right. Now, it's interesting you mentioned that, because it does sound like there is a level of subjectivity even at the professional level. But one of the questions that kept popping up for us on our side was warning signs. And from the sounds of it, it almost sounds like you can't say it's this, and this always. It could be many things. It could be a couple things. So how do you sort of get that into a package where the average person can consume it and understand it and be able to take some actionable steps in their own life?
Wow, that's a really great question.
I'm glad I came up with it.
Well, I think it's really important that we work at it as a culture so that we can see these warning signs. One of the things that NAMI is doing is trying to get programs out that are focusing more, upstream to the problem. One of them is called Ending the Silence, where we go into local schools and talk to, mostly right now at the high school level, and talk about mental health. And encouraging people to not ignore those early warning signs of feelings they may be having towards depression, speaking up, and trying not to hide what they're going through, because, again, early detection, early treatment is extremely important and helpful towards that road to recovery. The longer that someone goes untreated, the more damage that may be done that would be really hard to overcome.
So then I guess the next step or the next evolution in that thought process would be for the casual observer, what are some of the more eye-opening stats when it comes to mental illness and just how common and prevalent it actually is, where it isn't this thing that's sort of recessed in the backs of people's minds?
Well, when you stop and think that 1 out of 4 people will experience some form of mental illness in their lives, and I believe the latest stats is 1 out of 26 people will have a serious mental illness. It's really important to, when you talk about recognizing first symptoms, it is really important not to brush someone off as, wow, they're just like, I don't know, like, I don't know what's going on with them, but they're acting weird, they're doing something abnormal. If we stop for a few minutes and ask ourselves, hey, we need to check in and see if this person is okay, just asking them, how are you doing? And also recognize that there's the usual teenage and adolescence moodiness, and then there's beyond that, and beyond that it can be, again, those first warning signs of a depression coming on. The other side of it, though, is mania, and it's very important to realize that if you know someone who isn't sleeping and has been up and seems to be really almost to the point of, wow, what kind of drugs are they on? That's a huge warning sign, and that is something that I hope people would take action immediately, because that can turn into a very tragic situation very, very quickly, especially with mania. So
then the flip side of that is if in a perfect world we're able to tackle mental illness, the focus then I would imagine would turn more towards the caregivers, which is what you guys seem to put a little more energy into. What kind of stresses do they encounter? What types of struggles do they tend to go through, the caregivers, in those circumstances when they are caring for a family member or a friend or something like that who does struggle with a mental illness of some kind?
I think the largest struggle for caregivers is, again, when somebody that they love is in denial, or, and this is a very important part here, is that we may think that they're in denial, but they may actually, and very often, do not have insight to their illness.
Okay.
And this is the struggle that we have as a caregiver, is how do you help somebody who is resisting care but they're resisting care for probably what to them is a really good reason. They don't feel that they have an illness. They can't see their behavior in that way. And so for caregivers, that's the biggest struggle, I think, and it's the one that we grieve the most about, is that if we could just get them to the right doctor, if we could just get them on the right medication, if we could just get them to go to a peer support group, everything would be so much better. And that is true. But the struggle of getting somebody ready to accept their illness and to understand their illness, that is the trickiest part for the caregivers.
And independently, all of those things that you just mentioned are in some cases difficult to come across, especially in more rural parts of the region. You mentioned support groups, you mentioned just actual care, actual access to simple, what would be psychiatric care, that sort of thing requires transportation, a drive, going to a place, even beyond just getting over the initial step of needing help, recognizing that help exists, then getting to it becomes the next step. Is that one of the big struggles that you guys tend to see sort of play out regionally?
Most definitely. We, even in Ithaca, we feel like we're very fortunate, and we are fortunate that we have really good services.
Yeah.
However, we keep coming across some similar roadblocks, and that is, if you're lucky enough to have insurance and your insurance covers care, getting those services all gathered up and coordinated for somebody, like you said, getting them to the doctor's appointments, getting them to the different support groups. A lot of family members, caregivers also have their own jobs and lives, and it is very difficult. That is one thing that is one of our goals for the next 3 to 5 years, is trying to do better coordination with services and trying to work out better aftercare plans when people are released from the hospitals.
Right.
A lot of our hospitals in this area are acute care hospitals where someone is there only to be stabilized. And of course, our opinion of stabilized is much different in a lot of cases. And then moving them on to outpatient care, which is really great in theory, but it is difficult. But I think that having organizations like NAMI who can offer that support, and we've been there, we've done that, we know how to get the most out of the system that we have.
Right.
But the other side of it too is that we're continuing all the time to work on better care as a system, and how can we better make sure that folks are getting the help that they need.
So then I would be curious to know what the sort of insight is. Obviously, the goal, I would imagine, is to make mental health treatments as basic or fundamental as going to your doctor, your general practicing doctor. Is that easier said than done, just given the stigma that exists around mental health and mental illness as it is now, even though in theory access today is better than it was 20 or 30 or 40 years ago?
It is, and we're still struggling to understand this. It's really hard to, as a family member, it's amazing. It may take a couple years or more to convince somebody that they need to get help and treatment, and then you're so elated that they've decided to move forward with that, and then you're hit with, oh my gosh, now what? Finding the right therapist who offers the right type of therapy, and also who has openings, who takes your insurance. It is a difficult process. And it is very, very, very important to know that it's possible. It happens. I mean, but it is very daunting, especially in some situations. There may be other stresses going on in the family that make it very difficult for them to have any type of resources or energy to do this in addition to what their daily lives presents for them. So again, it's why we're here, because family members need a lot of support, because a lot of times it falls on the shoulders of the family members to make all this happen.
Now, you talked earlier about presenting potentially with multiple mental illnesses or multiple issues. Then I guess my question would be, what about those who are also dealing with issues like domestic violence, substance use disorders, all these other things that can also be sort of intertwined with the mental illness factor? And how, I mean, is it really even reasonable to try and address one without also being mindful of the others, or can it be done sort of independently?
Well, yeah, that's a tough one. The good news is that we are making a lot of progress in understanding that, particularly when it comes to substance abuse and mental illness, it used to be that you went one place for substance abuse care and another place for mental health care. And in a lot of cases, there might have been actually you need to take care of this first before you can do that. And we are definitely seeing a lot of progress in understanding that you need to treat the whole person. And then the other part of your question is, we are seeing some progress. And certainly, I think almost every family member would want more, certainly much more progress in including the family in all treatment plans. And so this is a very tricky part, but everybody that I've talked to, I haven't talked to any care provider in the last 10 years that was just like, yeah, no, that is not the way to go. Because it's very important to realize that even if the family is involved and it kind of comes to light that maybe there's a lot more going on in this person's life than their own illness, that's really important to know that there's also other people in the immediate network the person is living in that they also may need some support and care as well. Some mental illnesses are definitely hereditary, and a lot of mental illnesses go untreated and undiagnosed. So there's quite a few people out there that can kind of cope in a way, or they're at least sustaining themselves through many years of mental illness without any care or treatment.
So switching gears back to the young people in education, the educational aspect of it, how young is too young? Because that seems to be the crux of at least part of the debate. Some folks think that it should be introduced as early as possible. Some other folks feel like it should be held off a little bit, especially when the discussion starts to overlap a little bit with suicide and things like that. Is there sort of any evidence out there to suggest that there's a sweet spot where, maybe at 8 to 10 or 10 to 12 range, or is it kind of one of those things where everybody's still learning and trying to figure out what the best approach is?
I think we still have certainly some to learn there, but I think what we are learning is that the earlier the better, because we have children who are actually committing suicide at 7 and 8 years old. So they didn't just wake up and decide that was what they were going to do that day. This is something that's been moving in that direction for a while. We're also finding out that trauma is affecting people much more than I think that we realized. And trauma can be an major traumatic event. But what we're finding out that there's a lot of trauma, ongoing trauma that is happening in young folks' lives that isn't being addressed. Like you said, domestic violence. There's kids that are exposed to quite a bit of violence, drug abuse, neglect that isn't being addressed, and we're finding that the younger that we can speak to folks, and it's approached in a way that is age appropriate,
right?
But to just not talk about it hasn't worked. Mm-hmm. So, that's one of the things that we talk about in our educational classes is what you've been doing hasn't been working, then stop doing that and figure out something else that will work. Mm-hmm. So that's what we're figuring out, that we actually need to, again, start talking about good mental health at an early age, and then hopefully that will help young folks realize that there are people that they can reach out to and talk to, especially if there's a tough family situation at home. And so it's important for them to speak up and let people know how they're feeling.
Does it seem like there is more of that, or kids are more open to talk about that sort of thing at a young age now compared to maybe 20 or 30 years ago?
It does, unfortunately, seem like we're seeing more and more younger children with certainly with depression. It's certainly on the rise. And there's, I think, lots of different contributing factors to that. It's most of the time it's in a lot of cases our lifestyles have changed. The way that children are spending their free time is much different than it was 20 years ago. We need to understand that there's a lot of good, healthy things that children really need in their lives. And I think it's unfortunate that sometimes what we think is brand new and shiny and new technology might actually not be the best thing for young folks.
So I have to ask, because one of the trends that we started to see set up when we were asking questions on social media, a little bit of a generational divide. Older folks were a little more backed away from being interested in talking about it or asking questions. Young people seemed a little more inclined to ask specific questions. Maybe it's a matter of better understanding because there is more of that education happening now in schools as opposed to what was years ago. But does that sort of give you hope for what's possible with future generations, the next two generations specifically, in what really could be a tidal change in how all this is approached?
It gives us a lot of hope, and that's actually one of the things that we stress all the time is that we're never going to give up hope. You always keep hoping for better outcomes. And again, it's very exciting, all of the research that they're able to do now on mental illnesses and the brain. It's a matter, though, of hoping that our government keeps supporting folks with mental illness and ways for them to get help and care, So it wasn't that long ago that, if you had a mental illness, your insurance company didn't have to cover that. And I think now a lot more people are aware of that and understand that could disappear very quickly.
So then, shifting this to sort of the medical side before we run out of time here, there's been a little bit of a change in how medical care is administered by trend. So urgent care centers have become increasingly popular, the sort of on-demand methodology of getting regular medical care. Does that concern the folks that are on the other side of this in the mental health realm, just in terms of having to sort of reinvent the wheel and how they administer it to be more run and gun style, where they're on the go, ready to go, accepting people at the door rather than well, you need to make an appointment, and then you need to do this, and you need to wait 3 days, and because it seems like that's sort of being cut out, or at least being lessened. Are there concerns about the system being able to handle that change as it continues to get more and more fast-paced in years to come?
I think the main concern is just having services available, period. Mm-hmm. And I think that we got to get to that step first. I don't think, I haven't heard that come up as a concern so much as I'm just shocked to learn in some cases that somebody may have an immediate intake appointment, but then might have to wait 2 months to actually see a psychiatrist. Even at Cornell and Ithaca College, we're located in Ithaca, so I know those colleges quite well. We've had some of their students come in and speak with us, and they could wait 2 weeks to see somebody, not even like an intake appointment. So I think 2 weeks is unacceptable. Mm-hmm. Folks do need help immediately, and it's going to be a challenge. But again, just having the care just having the ability of someone to get care to begin with mm-hmm. is the first step. The other side of that, though, too, is stopping care too soon. Yeah. And that's a huge, huge, huge problem that most of our caregivers feel that, we've made some great progress, and sometimes, in a lot of cases, as soon as that person walks out the door of whatever facility they're in, they may go right back and be like, yeah, nope, I'm good. I'm not going to take medication. I'm not going to go see anybody. Mm-hmm. So it's very heart-wrenching for family members to see that happen.
So then is 5 to 7 years from now, what does the improvement look like in the Finger Lakes? Or what are some of the, if anybody's going to be sort of using a benchmark system, what are some of the things that we'll be able to identify in 5 to 7 years to say, we were successful in improving X, Y, and Z mm-hmm. and making this better mm-hmm. for what?
Well, zero suicide rate mm-hmm. is a huge one that we're working on. We're also working on better wraparound services, so less homelessness when it comes to mental health. Now, in most cases, who would choose to be out in the cold, in their right mind? And mm-hmm. so there's a few people, maybe, but I think you're going to find that the large percentage of all of our homeless people are people who are working with a drug addiction and or mental illness. Now, one thing that I think is very positive is we're starting to see people consider drug addiction as a mental illness. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping that it starts to play out in the media even more, mm-hmm. because I think people need to recognize that, again, who wants to be a drug addict, really? If you get right down to it, right. Yeah, maybe that drug feels good for a moment, but who wants to live on the streets just waiting for their next fix? That is not a sane.
So, with your organization specifically, how can folks learn more about what you guys are doing, learn more about getting involved, maybe sort of see some materials that could help them take some actionable steps? Sure.
So we do a lot of outreach at Hugo Medical Center with the folks that are up there, but anybody else that's listening that's not been there and know about us, you can certainly find us on our website, NamiFingerLakes.com. We have a great program starting January 26th. It's a 12-week class that we offer. Mm-hmm. It is free to anybody and whoever wants to come to Ithaca. We have people that come all over. We've had 2 people that were just in the last group that were from Binghamton that came up. Mm-hmm. We've had people come from Sarah, Pennsylvania. We've had people come from over towards Rochester. It's a 12-week program. It's called Family to Family. It's starting January 26th, and they can go on our website and find out more about Family to Family and also how to sign up and get enrolled in the program.
All right. Well, I appreciate the time. Obviously, really deep, interesting. We could spend 30 minutes on each of these individual components that we've been talking about. Really appreciate you making the drive, though, and coming up to talk to us.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you what we're doing and also letting people know that there's always hope and there's always an opportunity for better outcomes tomorrow.
Absolutely. That's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank our guests as well as our sponsors and listeners for making today's show possible. Don't forget to download the FingerLakes1.com app for the latest breaking news alerts on your mobile device and look for new episodes of the podcast every Thursday and Sunday exclusively on FingerLakes1.com. Thanks for listening. Be well, and we will see you next time.